Good afternoon. I'm Kristen Huber, and on behalf of 451 Research in Tanium, I'd like to welcome everyone and say thank you for attending today's webcast. Leading off the presentation today will be Eric Hanselman, who is Chief Analyst at 451 Research. Following Eric will be Eric Christensen, Senior Director of Product Marketing at Tanium. Before we get started, just a couple of quick housekeeping items. After the two presentations, we'll have a brief Q&A period. In order to ask a question, simply click the question button and we'll get to as many as possible. If not, we'll respond after the webcast. The presentation will be made available to all attendees once the webinar is complete. It'll be available on demand. And lastly, please provide feedback at the end of the webinar. And with that, I'll turn it over to Eric.
Thanks, Kristen. Now, as we've titled the webinar, I think a lot of you understand the idea that we really seem to be getting to the brink in terms of the amount of tasks and overload that's been piled on top of our information technology teams broadly. We think about how we're really looking to manage a lot of our security capabilities, our operational capabilities, all of the pieces that we really need to be able to do to keep systems up and running and healthy, all of those sort of operational hygiene things that we're doing on day in, day out. Teams today are facing a lot of different challenges in terms of both the task load, the density that we're expecting them to be able to handle, but also in many cases are running into complexities because of the management infrastructure they happen to be working with on top. We've grown a lot of our infrastructure and our management capabilities and the management systems we're using organically. Typically, we've added a new system to handle different things. We've been able to go handle different types of tasks. We've seen new kind of capabilities. We added a new tool to do whatever the new task or capability or fit whatever the regulatory requirement is we've been tasked with. But the difficulty is that then means that we've got a significant amount of not only responsibility, but a lot of different screens that we're looking at, just simply to be able to manage all the pieces. And much like this overburdened container ship, that's one of those things that just gradually continues to pile on until our teams really start to bend. And it's important to identify what those problems are before we get to the breaking point, before we get to that situation in which we were just simply tasking with too many things and too many tools in order to manage it. It's a challenge, and I think in many cases we can be well-intentioned in terms of trying to go identify how we want to handle it. We can think that, hey, the new tool is really going to help move us forward, but that can present as many challenges as what we're looking towards. So if we think about enterprise priorities, and this is some background data from our Voice of the Enterprise studies, and it's looking at really what are enterprises trying to do in terms of prioritizing investment in terms of IT. And if you think about what those priorities are, they're probably not going to be all that surprising, but I want to point them out because we think about what we're trying to invest in. We want to be able to get faster response to the lines of business that we're serving. We want to be able to become more efficient to reduce costs. We want to make sure that what we're delivering is reliable and available. And by the way, it's got to be secure at the same time. So these are all sort of motherhood and apple pie, but if we think about where we happen to be investing in a lot of this, in a lot of cases, it doesn't align with what the real outcomes are that we can really expect. Now, it's not that we don't have reasonable budgets, and I think everybody out there would hope to be able to get a larger budget than they have today, but if we think about information technology particularly, we're seeing a very healthy market. So there are dollars out there to spend. But my point is, I think we need to reassess how we actually happen to be spending those budgetary dollars, what we're really doing to invest to be able to get greater capability. This, again, is more data from our Voice of the Enterprise study in terms of overall direction and information security budget intent. And you see that more than half are seeing a slight increase in terms of budget. You've got 15% that are seeing a significant increase, 23% that aren't seeing any change. So, there's budget out there to do it, but we need to approach the way in which we're typically spending a lot of that InfoSec, operational budget, all those tool investments that we're making to be able to do this with a little more sense and to be focused towards efficiency in managing it. The problem that we run into in a lot of this is that we're tasked with a whole range of different by tasks and things that we've got to be able to accomplish. So we think about what we're putting together. We've got to make sure that this whole laundry list of things is taken care of. And we've got a tendency to be able to start thinking about this in ways that we invest in individual tools to handle it. And that can complicate our team's lives in terms of what they're doing and really how they're addressing it. The difficulty when we've got so many different priorities and we start looking at a whole wealth of different kind of capabilities to be able to address them is that we just simply wind up running slower and slower. And we just simply wind up being able to spend all of our time simply directed at trying to keep the tool infrastructure running, trying to manage all these different problems. And this can lead to all sorts of difficulties as we're trying to get towards to more efficient postures. That can actually slow us down just simply because of the fact that we're busy enough dealing with all of the tasks that we've got. And it's a point at which a recognition about what those challenges are and a better approach can start to get us on a track to actually become truly more efficient and to be able to shed some of the tasks that are typically holding us back. But it's the point at which you've got to actually get to the point at which you're realizing it, in which you can start to move forward. And actually, I wanted to bring Eric into the conversation here to talk about some paths to be able to head down that road. So, Eric, what ideas do you have in terms of putting this together, and how can you approach being able to do this more effectively and efficiently?
Yeah, thanks, Eric. Totally agree. Great setup for what I wanted to talk about. And I love the analogy around the container ship and the sloth in particular. It's a great picture, great visual. So what we'd like to call this sort of the essence of this problem within a organization, or it's sort of the result of this problem ends up being is related to security hygiene. And most organizations, security hygiene or cyber hygiene, as some may call it, is just fundamentally broken. And so we'll talk about why, some additional things to what the analogies and examples that Eric gave, and we'll get into really why Tanium can help address this problem different. Because this is not a new topic. Like, we've been talking about operational security hygiene for many, many years. There are lots of point tools that are supposedly trying to help solve this topic for organizations, but it's failing. And we'll go through some stats, but if you look at many of the stats, all indications are that it's really the primary reason that organizations are getting breached. So what I'd like to go through today is again, how Tanium can actually help improve security hygiene. We also want to spend a bit more time in doing that on a new product module we have called Tanium Comply. I'll talk about what a product module is, but Comply is essentially a way to address one of the most pressing issues of security hygiene, and that's configuration compliance at scale, which feeds into regulatory compliance and a whole host of other security hygiene things. But let's really start with sort of the why security hygiene is important, or why Tanium believes it's important. And really that comes down to the fact if you look at the overall trends, which funnel down to individual organizations, what you see is actually the effectiveness of security spend is going down. So we're spending more money, but the effectiveness in the way that spend is, ultimately the goal of that spend is to prevent breaches, reduce risk, and reduce cost related to preventing those breaches. It's actually going down. So a few data points to support that fact. The first is, there are many sources, including actually the stats that Eric showed us here before, that tell us cybersecurity spend is increasing at a relatively fast rate. This stat comes from a PwC study of budget change between 2014 and 2015. We can also just look around the industry and at things like conferences, especially like RSA, to see the number of vendors and the number of funding that's going into the market to know that security spend is really at a peak. Yet at the same time as spend is going up, the number of incidents are actually on the rise at an even greater rate. And that would be interesting by itself, but what's even more interesting is that the cost of each of those incidents is actually going up. If you look at this other stat of the cost of a breach or an incident going from $3.7 million to $4 million in the same time period. Obviously, these trends are at odds and mean that a dollar spent on cybersecurity is actually having less impact. To further illustrate that point, we also see that very few organizations are actually evaluating the effectiveness of their spend. And although there are many factors here, ineffective existing tools that have been put in place over the last 20 years, and some of the problems that Eric mentioned are at the root of this problem. So at Tanium, we believe another factor driving the continuation of ineffective spend is really an over-focus on malware prevention in the industry. This is largely driven by lots of marketing hype and highly funded startups that are targeting existing AV budgets. And while we don't disagree that some level of malware prevention is a good thing for security hygiene, it's not the only thing that an organization needs to think about, and that's sort of the key message here. Because without good hygiene in place, it's actually very unlikely that you'll even get full deployment of whatever your AV agent is, whether it's next gen or old gen. But above and beyond malware, there really are many other risks when it comes to cybersecurity that malware prevention simply doesn't address, including insider threats, credential-related hacking. There's also just the operational risk of security, including system stability that might be introduced by changes that are made for security reasons, or even the regulatory compliance fines that you might have if you don't adhere to the standards that are out there. And while we know there's no single technology that can prevent 100% of attacks, even the malware vendors will tell you that, we do know that the vast majority of attacks could be prevented simply through good security hygiene. And what most experts in multiple studies, including this compelling statistic from the Verizon data breach report that came out last year, what they all point out is that ultimately most intrusions are the result of exploited vulnerabilities, including configuration errors, things like out-of-date patching, and other issues of poor security hygiene that we'll show some illustrations around. This is a really key point in cybersecurity, and that is despite knowing from many organizations like CIS, SANS, and NIST, there are many best practices that come from organizations like that, and also supposedly having an existing set of tools that are already in place to address these problems. These types of best practices are just not being followed. The doors and windows are being left over, as we like to say at Tanium. And we see this at Tanium many times at new customers when they first install our product and are finally given visibility to the full extent of the problem in their organization. So this is a really painful but real example of an actual organization. And when you look at these stats for unmanaged assets, almost 9,000 unmanaged assets they did not know about before Tanium, out of 30,000 total assets. So almost around 20% of their assets were completely unknown and completely blind to them. The fact that they didn't have SCCM, which was their primary management tool, communicating in a large portion of their environment. If you look at the combination of the unmanaged assets and the lack of coverage or failing SCCM clients, and you really get almost half the environment that they were blind to. And that results in some pretty poor outcomes in terms of security hygiene. 77% of endpoints missing 6 or more critical updates. So if you think about each of those critical updates being a potential way in for an attacker. And probably the most compelling to me is over 90% of endpoints with a vulnerable version of Adobe Flash. And that obviously is a major problem when you consider that Adobe Flash is one of the biggest ways in from a ransomware perspective.
Yeah, and Eric, looking at some of these statistics, and just for our audience, we've got a poll that's running in the background. So by all means, respond to the poll, and we'll take a look at some of the ideas as to sort of what you've got.
Yeah.
We've already got a few people who are responding. But the kinds of numbers that you're putting up here are typical of what we see with our end-user clients as well. This is something, if we think about really what the challenges are, you've got a range of different systems. You've got, in many cases, different teams that are handling these capabilities. So you've got an operational team that's handling remediation. You've got a security team that's looking to be able to go manage some of this. All of these are problems that can lead to a lot of complexity in terms of how we sort of push this back and forth. In a lot of cases, we got people sort of chucking things over the fence at each other. The lists of sort of endpoints to be remediated may not actually align from both sides. So if you're taking an assessment tool from one side and pitching those numbers back to your operational team, a lot of times there's not alignment in terms of what they want to be able to work with. So you've now got multiple sources of truth and potentially multiple systems, and what I like to refer to as the screen whiplash problem, in which you've got to consult a bunch of different systems in order to make that all work. It's a challenge.
Yeah, absolutely. So it sounds like it's a familiar problem to you, and it looks like we got a few responses in the chat. Basically, a 50-50 split right now between somewhat confident and not confident at all. And the interesting thing that we find is confidence is really key here, because we find organizations that think they know how many endpoints they have, and then when we implement Tanium, they actually find between 12 and 20% more unmanaged assets than they thought they did before. So that even organizations that might feel confident, we've found many times that it turns out that they didn't know in the first place.
And the other thing I'd also point out is one of the things we see with some of our clients is that the time between iterations of those scans can also run fairly long too. So a lot of the contribution to that is just the fact that they're not able to go do a really comprehensive scan all that frequently.
Yeah, environments are very complex. It comes down to that. They're very complex. They're transient, and it's very difficult with existing technologies to ask these sorts of questions. Another interesting one that we often see is actually the deployment of AV agents and existing management agents. We referenced the SCCM example in the previous one. But endpoint technologies are just many times difficult to deploy and maintain, and between 5 and 20% of the environment we often find completely uncovered by AV or through patch management. So I think that hopefully sets the stage pretty well as to what we see and why we believe this is such a problem. So the next question is really, why is this happening? And let's get a little bit more specific about what are the problems that are affecting all of these existing tools and existing environments, because obviously it's not a shortage of people or good intent. Like, everyone wants to do this. It's a failure around many different aspects here. So the way that we characterize this is that there are plenty of existing tools. So we mentioned that, and it starts out with the existence of silos between those tools, where there's a hard divide between assessment and change. There's even divides between tools that do things like discovery of assets from doing things like evaluating compliance of those assets. And what ends up happening as a result is that there are disconnects over what the source of truth is between tools. There also ends up being long windows between assessment and change, and to Eric's point, even the time it takes to run many of these types of assessments can run a long time, which kind of feeds into the next point here, which is you have issues of scalability and speed with many of the tools in this market. If you want to get an answer to a basic question like how many endpoints or what endpoints comply with a certain configuration benchmark, it might actually take you days or even weeks to cover an entire organization. And of course, depending on how big your organization is, certainly we've worked with many customers in the hundreds of thousands of endpoint range where it's just impossible to do these sorts of things without a technology like Tanium. Then as you bridge over to the change side of things, you see that many existing endpoint technologies are pretty brittle, as we referenced before, with SCCM and AV and the difficulty in managing those sorts of technologies. And that results in pretty large gaps in the environment, which again, the tools that you think that you have deployed may actually not be fully deployed or healthy. And then the final point here is because of all these issues, the speed and the brittle technologies that we mentioned, you end up with a lack of confidence that changes can be made or potentially remediated if update were to go wrong. The net result of that is that security updates to critical systems often go completely ignored. So all of these things combined leave an extremely low bar for attackers looking for a way in. And again, essentially the doors and windows are left open. Eric, does that point of view make sense to you?
And it does, very definitely. I mean, because to your point, I mean, that the SCCM example I think is a great one because you've got a communications infrastructure that has a whole set of dependencies. Being able to get to an individual endpoint that may be disconnected, user communities that are honestly reluctant to be able to to keep up with a lot of what gets seen as intrusive operational pieces without a real solid understanding of what the long-term impacts are of that. All of these contribute to create this whole set of problems. It's a challenge. And especially when you've got teams who are managing what may be multiple systems and have to coordinate potentially across not only silos between tools as you're identifying, but silos between teams, and not having a common language with which to reference a lot of the assets that you're trying to protect and secure and really keep healthy.
Absolutely. Yeah, back to the source of truth. It's important to have a single source of truth that teams can work against because there are good reasons to have separate teams in this space. And in many cases, it's about enabling those teams to work better together.
Yeah, well, I mean, for separation of duties, you want to make sure that you've got some team dispersion in order to manage the distribution of those tasks, but you got to make sure they're all speaking the same language.
Absolutely. So, sort of the next thing to sort of bridge over into here, the natural thing is, and I'm sure what all of you are wondering is, okay, this is great, you're right about these problems, but how does Tanium really fix these problems? So let me spend a little bit more time talking now about Tanium, how we address security hygiene specifically, but then Tanium in general for those of you who are new to Tanium on the line, and then get specifically into our Tanium Comply module, which really hits at one of the core issues of security hygiene. So Tanium's differentiation is really rooted in a unique architecture and a platform approach to endpoint security and management. We call the architecture behind Tanium linear chaining, but the important thing is, and we won't spend a ton of time talking about the architecture, lots of resources online and opportunities to do that in following conversations, but with Tanium, we essentially break down the limitations of traditional hub and spoke architecture, and instead we distribute communications out to local and area networks between endpoints themselves. We'll talk more about our platform approach later and how we're bringing together lots of different capabilities with product modules, but that's the core of what makes us different. Because of that approach, our architecture and our platform approach, we can plug many of the critical gaps in security hygiene. For one, administrators can perform inventory and discovery activities with minimal endpoint and network overhead on demand. We'll talk about some of those activities coming up on another slide. Assessments, including things like configuration compliance, can be performed very quickly. One of the real core benefits of our architecture is speed, and we're able to perform assessments, essentially visibility within even extremely large environments, but it's just as applicable in even mid-size and even some small-size environments where there's a lot of complexity. We can perform those sorts of assessments in seconds, and we're in some of the largest networks in the world and proven from that perspective. Changes can also be made confidently in that, the inverse of the problem I mentioned before, critical systems can now be monitored and revert it if needed because you have confidence in your ability to do that. And then finally, Tanium provides a single, complete platform and really a source of truth for security hygiene activities. That really nets out to reduced risk through significantly greater attack surface reduction, and again, back to confidence in the state of your security hygiene, so you can answer questions confidently. So we're not going to get too much into it, but another core aspect of Tanium is that we have other use cases that we can serve, and another use case that we serve really, really well is the detection and response use case, so being able to find things on endpoints and respond to them. So when you combine Tanium, what we can do for security hygiene with the ability to detect and respond in a single platform, you really get the most effective way to do endpoint security at scale, and really efficiently, back to the original point here, making your spend more efficient. Okay, so that's a little upfront on how Tanium can help with security hygiene. Now I just want to take a step back and talk about what Tanium is, and give you a little bit more context before jumping into specifically comply. And of course, please ask questions, and we'll answer questions at the end. Tanium is comprised of two things at a high level: our core platform that is enabled by the unique architecture that I talked about, and a portfolio of product modules that each address a specific security or management problem. The product module mission, and I'll spend a little bit more time talking about product modules here in a second, but essentially it is to simplify customer environments by consolidating niche endpoint solutions, reducing the number of agents by delivering capabilities that before you would have had to buy separate point tools that were completely disconnected. Now you can buy one platform with a single agent, single infrastructure, and all of the speed and scale benefits of the core Tanium architecture. So that's kind of a key point here. The other thing is our core platform, which can really address a number of use cases, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. But essentially the idea being that you can ask questions and take any action. Okay, so back to the Tanium core platform here. So the Tanium core platform is really unique in the market in the way it enables a number of use cases based on the ability to ask natural language questions and really take action against systems at scale. So what we mean by ask is that we have a built-in Google-like search engine that is both powerful and intuitive. Questions can be constructed from simple natural language statements, and even more advanced questions can be asked and constructed. And many of our customers use this capability to do lots of different things like ad hoc security hunting, inventory management, or looking for anomalies like unusual processes or other indicators that might be on your endpoints. What we mean here by no is that you get answers to questions you ask in seconds. This is unlike many alternative solutions that can help you answer some of these types of questions, but it might take hours or days to get back answers, as we mentioned with security hygiene specifically. And by the time you get that answer, the data is really useless. With Tanium, we give you that speed, and we also give you complete visibility. So you can see anything on the endpoint, essentially. So that's a key differentiator for us. And so that the final part here is that you can act. So not only can you have visibility, but you can have control, and you can take any action. And so that's a really key thing from an ability to remediate security hygiene issues or remediate security issues. And we like to say anything you can do on a machine locally, it can be done with Tanium. So just tying a little bit more specifically the core platform and what you can do with asking questions, getting answers, and taking response from an assessment and change perspective back to security hygiene, there's a significant amount you can do just based on that core platform capability. From an assessment standpoint, you can find out how many endpoints there are, or even what applications are either installed or currently running right now in the network in seconds. You can also look at the configuration of those endpoints, including the state of endpoint agents or even security controls such as AV. And using the ability to search for different applications and versions in your environment can also enable ad hoc hunting for out-of-date versions of critical applications like Java and Flash. On the change side or the control side, the ability to take any actions opens up numerous opportunities such as blocking unmanaged assets, removing unauthorized software, patching applications, making enterprise-wide configuration updates to respond to new threats, and repairing system security settings at scale. And there are literally many more on both sides, particularly when you can extend Tanium in any way that you can imagine. So above and beyond the core platform, and while we started with the core platform, we really quickly saw the opportunity to extend Tanium to address specific use cases or problems our customers were experiencing. Each product module extends the platform in some way, meaning that they all take advantage of the speed and scale benefits we discussed. They also use the single Tanium agent to essentially converge a number of use cases into what would have been before done using separate agents, adding lots of complexity to your environment. Tanium simplifies your environment through that single agent. And the other aspect here is since product modules are built on a consistent UI, we can do some really interesting things to increase agility, like having workflows between activities, which is way more efficient than having different tools for each job that really have no connection between themselves, or even worse, having complicated integration projects that stitch together existing tools and become brittle in themselves. Which really brings us to Tanium Comply, which is our newest product module. We just announced it this last month. Comply brings Tanium's speed and scale advantages to the problem of security configuration compliance. Compliance, when we were looking at this module and deciding what our next module was, compliance was one of the things that ranked pretty high on most CIOs' list of headaches and has come up frequently in our conversations within public sector and Global 2000 accounts. The complaint that we often hear is that typically compliance is in the configuration portion of that is a pretty tedious and slow process. And so our customers that were feeling that pain and looking at these problems asked Tanium to come in and help. And so we came in and built some prototypes, and we have a number of customers that we've worked with before Comply's GA, and we've seen incredible results. And we'll talk a little bit about one specific customer here in a second. So unlike other tools, the specific differentiation around Comply is it works at scale. Based on the Tanium architecture, it can deliver results around configurations, which I'll talk about in a second, in seconds or in really short time periods. So the key thing I like to say about Comply is Comply makes benchmarks actionable. So the way this works is Tanium Comply leverages standard libraries of automated benchmarks. The types of benchmarks that if those of you are on the line are familiar with organizations like CIS and NIST and even the U.S. government and the DISA and the DoD, these sorts of automated benchmarks that can check configurations. So we provide a simple way to extend those with custom checks so you can assess internally defined configuration standards alongside those industry standard checks. We can perform assessment on those benchmarks, as I mentioned, in short time periods. And we actually, one of the early customers that we worked with here was in the federal government space, where we literally transformed the compliance assessment process that previously took them 2 to 3 weeks to check over 100,000 endpoints to just 5 minutes. So we're seeing a ton of success in the government space, the commercial space as well, where we are really fundamentally changing the way companies think about compliance from this sort of weird activity that you do on a semi-regular basis, or you do just to prepare for an audit, to something that you can do. And obviously, continuous compliance has been messaged for a long time, but really on demand, truly on demand in a large organization. So, sort of to wrap this up and just close out on Comply. The problem in the industry that Tanium is addressing with Comply is that there are literally no tools that are able to perform these sorts of standard benchmark configuration checks at enterprise scale. It takes weeks to get through every endpoint, and by that time the data is stale and often just incomplete. To really get other tools in the industry working in large environments, they have to throttle back the frequency which they check compliance on endpoints. They also end up having to buy and manage a lot of extra hardware. So Tanium Comply can validate system configurations against standard benchmarks on demand, as we mentioned, with really minimal overhead. It does that on the single agent and infrastructure of Tanium, which can solve a variety of IT operations and security problems above and beyond compliance, including the ability to discover unmanaged assets through things like threat detection, investigate incidents, or remediate at scale. So with that, you can learn more at Tanium.com. Please register to see one of our weekly live demonstrations, or to see a Tanium demonstration in person. And really appreciate everyone joining and listening. And I guess at this point, Eric, we can wrap up and take any questions that have shown up in the chat.
Sounds good. Oh, thanks, Eric. We've got a number of questions, and for those who are listening, by all means, if you have questions, please submit them in the question box. We'll try to get to all the questions that we have. I think we've got enough time to be able to touch on them. Any that we can't answer during the time we've got here, we'll be sure to follow up with each of you after the webinar. So I want to kick off with the first one, which looks like it's sort of talking about Comply and pieces around that. Is this a system that can support PCI or HIPAA assessments?
Yeah, so the relationship here, and often there's some confusion and discussion around regulatory compliance and configuration compliance. So most standards, and I'll take PCI as an example, and I believe it's Section 2 of PCI, what they say is you must configure your endpoints to some defined standard. And they actually reference organizations like CIS and NIST. So what we are doing with Tanium Comply is enabling you to meet that part of the PCI standard for configuring your endpoints. And we're doing that leveraging, instead of proprietary, benchmarks, we are actually leveraging the open benchmarks that have been agreed upon and are known to be good. Consensus-driven, as they say in the industry. So that's our strategy, and that's how it relates to things like PCI, others like HIPAA, and there are many, many other regulations in the U.S. and around the world that do similar things that say you must configure your endpoints to some security standard. It's a very similar relationship. So that's how they relate.
It's the operational piece of really making sure that you've got that end of the compliance piece really covered. And I think a key part that you'd mentioned earlier was the fact that it doesn't wind up being something where you've got visibility at discrete points in time. I know that a number of our clients are working hard to be able to get towards a continuous compliance posture. And the challenge, of course, is if the actual assessment task itself is really resource intensive, you can only run it so often, and that can present some challenges.
Absolutely.
Okay, the next question we've got is how well does this scale to large enterprises?
Yeah, great question. So with Tanium, we really started with very large organizations. We have currently, of the U.S. banks, 8 of the top 10 U.S. banks. We're some of the largest environments in the world in federal governments and in the banks and other organizations, leading organizations in their industry. So we started from the top down. Our architecture is, it is centered on the problem of scale in large organizations. Now there are benefits as you even move down into mid-size and small organizations of speed, that particularly when you get into compliance issues or security hygiene issues that are really, really relevant. So a key point here is Tanium started with the biggest of the big, but we are, by our benefits are by no means limited there. We have lots of applicability in speed and efficiency benefits and consolidation benefits of agents. All the same problems exist in most other organizations. And then you have the fact that in most organizations, endpoint counts are growing at a very, very fast rate. So in thinking about the technologies that organizations are using at the foundation of their stack, really, for endpoint security and management, you have to think about the future with cloud, with IoT, with other things expanding the number of endpoints in their network. An organization that might have 10,000 endpoints today could very quickly have 50,000, 60,000 endpoints in the not so distant future. So Tanium, as we like to say, is really can help organizations be ready for that shift, be ready for that future state.
Yeah, you've raised a good point. I mean, endpoint proliferation is something that we sort of got to the point at which we kind of got a grip on mobile, but there's an entire next wave that's coming out of that's going to require some fundamentally different ways of approaching just simply the device easy for me to say, the device proliferation that's already starting to turn up on our networks today.
Absolutely. Yeah, so, you can't buy a technology like this thinking about just today. You have to think about the future.
Well, it's like all good IT investments. You need to make sure that you're building a foundation that's going to support you in the long run. And I know that for a lot of us, the infrastructures we've got are already heavily taxed. And when you start really assessing what you're going to be looking at, down the road in the not too distant future, that presents some challenges. Okay, so the next question is something near and dear to my heart. Does this require the installation of new endpoint agents? Just basically a new endpoint agent, I think is what they're trying to say.
Yeah, and I mentioned it a couple times, but Tanium is, I think part of the problem is that people have gotten so used to hearing vendors talk about being a platform, and the reality is that they're not. And that when they mean a platform, they actually mean a bundle of point solutions. With Tanium, you actually truly have a platform in the sense that everything we do, we keep a single agent, we keep a single streamlined infrastructure. We don't add additional agents or complexity. And so there's a lot of concern in most organizations about adding new agents. And one of the real values and benefits with investing in Tanium that we found with our customers is that they're able to create a long-term roadmap that that it's not only just not adding a new agent, but it's actually reducing agents over the long term, and that can have some major financial benefits and operational benefits within an organization.
Yeah, I mean, if you can reduce the number of individual shims that you've got kicking around in the system, that's all for the better. Okay, next, how long does it take to deploy?
Yeah, it's a good question. So with Tanium, we can do deployments fairly quickly. It's a pretty lightweight agent, 10 megabytes on disk, 10 megabytes in memory. We have ways to deploy it. One of the technologies that we can help use is once we get a footprint in an environment, we can actually use a technology we have called Discover to look for unmanaged assets, and that's back to asking the question around what assets are in your network, and then you can actually use that to help close some of the gaps in your environment. One of the beautiful things about Tanium is once you do have it deployed and you have a new module like Tanium Comply, it's very easy to deploy. It's a matter of importing that solution into our server, and it's really done. Once you import it into the server and it pushes the required tools out to the endpoint behind the scenes, you have the ability to make use of the module right away. So there's a long-term value in that. With Tanium, you're going to continue to get new modules, new capabilities that you can continue to add value from over the long term once you have the core platform in place.
Being able to again build a foundation that you can leverage.
Absolutely.
Okay, so this is if there are other questions, by all means, feel free to ask them, folks. This is the last one on the list, though. How do I integrate this with existing systems? Do I have to rip and replace to get this functionality?
No, not at all. Well, several layers to that question. Layer one is Tanium, by virtue of the fact that we provide, nearly real-time, on-demand access to data on your endpoints on your network. That data is really valuable to lots of existing systems within an organization. For example, asset management systems, CMDBs. One of the biggest challenges with asset management is getting up-to-date information about applications installed in your network, or even beyond that, like what applications are actually being used. So with Tanium, we have a module within the platform called Connect, and it gives you the ability to route that type of data into CMDBs. The other aspect here is maybe our example here is on the security side. The data the context and enriched data that we're getting from the endpoint is very, very valuable to SIEM use cases. So in many cases, we complement products like Splunk and others by actually feeding context and additional data to help filter and better manage alerts. Filter out false positives from the true positives. So that's another kind of key use case, and so that's layer one: how we integrate with the existing IT ecosystem. Layer two of that discussion is how do we sit with other systems management and security technologies. And one of the really primary overlaps we run into many times is SCCM, as we talked about earlier in the discussion, which is being used as an existing management tool in Microsoft environments. And we actually work with SCCM fairly regularly. We have many, many complementary scenarios. There are a few overlaps, but there's enough that's complementary that some organizations do choose to keep both agents in the environment. In the case of SCCM, one of the things that we can do, and we actually have an article on our website about this, is help repair endpoint agent health, so that we are able to find gaps in SCCM coverage and close them. So that's a real way that we can complement an existing agent management tool that's out there. Antivirus is one I mentioned before. Is also one that we quite frequently are used to gain visibility into and repair the health of antivirus agents in an environment, and even deploy them to endpoints. So that's another really complementary scenario where it's not about rip and replace. It's about making the investments that you have, even better.
It's not a matter where you've got to displace what you've got. It's something that you can help to actually both provide context in terms of an event awareness perspective, but also to be able to actually manage some of the operational tasks, which, to my mind, is one of the larger pieces around this, which is just making sure that the environments that you have are as healthy as possible. And it's a challenge to make sure that you're keeping up with endpoint activity, basically everything that's going on, but it's also something where displacing what those tools are, straight out of the box is going to be a non-starter for most organizations, because you already got probably audit and compliance and whatever your regulatory requirements are that you're filling with these other capabilities, and you've got to make sure that they're still running well and effectively, because that's probably what your auditor is looking for in terms of data, until you can get them to a posture that is a little more sophisticated.
Absolutely. Well, are there any more questions, Eric?
That is all the questions that we have seen. So I think with that, we'll wrap it up. I want to thank all of the attendees for listening in and spending some time with us today. And Eric, thank you for all the background and perspectives. And with that, I think we'll turn it back over to Kristen.
Great. Well, as Eric said, that concludes today's webcast. And on behalf of 451 Research and Tanium, thank you so much for attending, and have a great day.